Hey guys, tonight we drift back more than 4,000 years to a place where the air itself smells like warm flour, smoke, and river mud. You're standing at the edge of Thebes, the ancient Egyptian city already awake long before dawn. Torches flicker against the mud brick walls, and the faint hiss of the Nile at flood season murmurs like white noise for your restless brain. In the half light, you can see them. Bakers moving like slow ghosts through the mist, arms powdered white, sandals leaving faint tracks in the dust. You probably won't survive this shift. It's too hot, too smoky, and someone's always shouting about dough that's too wet or not wet enough. But don't worry, you're just visiting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let me know your location and the time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're here to see how, quite by accident, Egyptian bakers invented one of the most soothing sounds in human history: the crackle of a perfect loaf cooling on a clay shelf. The city stretches in low humps of mud brick and palm leaf roofs. But this bakery, part of a larger temple complex, is a heartbeat of daily life. The workers begin before the sun even hints at gold. You feel the grit under your sandals as you step inside. Warm air, fragrant with yeast and wood ash, wraps around you. The head baker, a man with forearms like kneaded dough, greets you with a nod that means move or you'll get trampled. His name is Menka, and his family has been baking since before pyramids were fashionable. He gestures toward wide, shallow pits dug into the earth, primitive ovens that look like upside-down pots sunk halfway in. They call them tar ovens, and each one breathes fire through a narrow mouth. Mainstream historians agree that Egyptian bakers used emmer wheat and barley, ground by hand, mixed with water, and a pinch of salt. But what no one can say for sure is how that first loaf rose. Was it wild yeast from the Nile breeze, or the product of a forgotten lump of dough left too long in the heat? Historians still argue whether it was laziness, luck, or divine intervention that led to the first sourdough starter. As Menka and his apprentices work, the rhythm of scraping, scooping, and kneading builds like a heartbeat. Wooden paddles slap dough into shape, and someone hums a tune older than writing. You wipe your forehead. Even the air feels edible. Outside, Thebes begins to stir. Donkey carts rattle by, and the smell of roasting grain drifts down the alleyways. Somewhere nearby, a priest recites morning hymns to Ra, the rising sun god, because even celestial beings apparently appreciate the smell of bread. A small boy rushes in carrying a basket of dates. He drops one into your hand, sticky and sweet. You bite in, and the sugar hits like ancient candy, chased by a faint bitterness from dust in the air. Menka catches your eye and grins. "Good fruit," he says, "for strong work." His accent is thick, his humor dry as desert sand. He shows you how the dough rests under a damp linen cloth. The linen itself smells faintly of lotus oil, reused from temple offerings. Nothing goes to waste here, not even sacred fabric. He lifts a corner, and you see bubbles forming across the dough's surface like tiny moons. "Living," he says proudly. The dough breathes. It's strange to think of bread as alive, but to these bakers, it is. They speak to it, coax it, almost pray over it. One woman, elbows deep in a trough of flour, murmurs to her batch like a mother soothing a fussy child. "Rise, little son," she whispers. You catch yourself smiling. Outside, dawn finally breaks, a soft, coppery light spilling across the courtyard. The first birds wake up, sounding like squeaky hinges. The ovens glow brighter, and heat licks your shins. Menka tosses a handful of chaff into the flames, and the fire sighs in response. Mainstream history tells us Egyptians baked hundreds of bread types: flat, round, conical, even ones shaped like animals. Bread wasn't just food, it was currency, offering, and comfort. Wages were often paid in loaves. The soldiers at the frontier force lived on a daily bread ration that would make any modern carb counter faint. But a lesser-known tidbit is that bread sometimes doubled as record-keeping. Scribes pressed symbols into the dough before baking, temporary ledgers of taxes or temple deliveries. Somewhere in the ruins of Thebes, archaeologists have found these edible spreadsheets, baked hard as pottery. You picture it now. You, holding a loaf stamped with hieroglyphs, a receipt that smells faintly of honey and ash. It's bureaucracy you could bite into. Back in the bakery, a young apprentice slips on spilled water and lands squarely in a pile of flour. Everyone laughs, and he pops up like a ghost covered in white dust. Menka shakes his head, but can't suppress a grin. He'll make soft bread, he jokes. The boy bows theatrically. You can almost hear modern HR paperwork rustling somewhere in the future. You move toward the doorway for air. The sun now climbs over the city walls, gilding the rooftops and making the Nile shimmer like a ribbon of molten glass. Boats drift by carrying grain sacks from upstream villages. You imagine one of those sacks bursting open, the kernels scattering, and someday, somewhere, another baker discovering that left-behind dough can transform itself overnight. Historians still argue whether the first leavened bread was intentional or a lucky accident. Maybe Menka's ancestors once forgot a bowl of dough in the shade, returned the next day, and found it puffed with life. They tried baking it anyway, and that first golden loaf changed human cuisine forever. You feel that quiet pride ripple through the morning air. These bakers, nameless now, unknowingly shaped history with nothing but patience, sweat, and a good sense of smell. You lean against the doorway as the scent of fresh loaves fills your lungs. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, temple bells begin to toll, calling the city to worship. Menka slides a conical loaf from the oven, taps it lightly, and listens. The hollow sound makes him nod. "Good bread," he says simply. He breaks off a piece, offers it to you. The crust is crisp, the inside warm and slightly sour. You chew slowly, letting the taste linger, a flavor that has lasted millennia. The day has only begun, but you already feel the drowsy pull of the heat, the hum of work, the heartbeat of Thebes echoing in your chest. Maybe it's the bread, maybe it's the air, or maybe, just maybe, this is what ancient comfort tasted like. The air thickens with grain dust and gossip. You're standing at the stone grinding tables now, shoulder to shoulder with women whose forearms ripple like river current from endless motion. Each holds a flat basalt stone, rubbing it in patient circles over another, crushing emmer and barley into fine, pale powder. The rhythm is hypnotic. Stone over stone, breath over breath, like an ancient metronome for the city's heartbeat. Flour dust hangs in the morning light, making sunbeams visible in lazy streaks. It coats everything: lashes, lips, and lungs. You sneeze once, earning a sympathetic laugh from a nearby grinder, who hands you a damp cloth to tie around your face. "Too much flour, new one," she says with a wink. "But it smells better than camel sweat." She's right. Barely. The grinding floors of Egypt were always full of chatter. Historians tell us these weren't silent, servile places. They were the gossip hubs of their time. Here, among the heavy stones, people traded more than grain. You hear murmurs of a baker's daughter who's marrying a potter, and another rumor that the local scribe was caught napping behind the temple kiln. The news moves faster than papyrus. A bit of irony settles in. These women, whose work fuels a civilization, earn little more than the bread they make. Still, there's laughter, teasing, even singing. They turn monotony into melody. The rhythm is comforting. Swish, scrape, hum. You feel your own breathing begin to match it. Each grinder works barefoot, toes gripping the earth for balance. The floor is scattered with discarded husks, forming a soft layer like straw. Occasionally, a mouse darts by, bold as any worker, hoping for stray grain. Nobody screams. The mouse is just another part of the system. In a way, he's the earliest food inspector. You watch one woman sprinkle a few drops of water onto her stone to keep the flour from clumping. The scent that rises is warm, nutty, almost sweet. That's the smell of ancient labor, bread before it becomes bread. She offers you a feel of the powder. It's rougher than modern flour, almost sandy, with flecks of husk that will later give every loaf a hearty chew. Modern bakers would call it whole grain. Egyptians called it food. A mainstream historical fact you could jot down. Archaeologists have found grinding stones so worn they've carved smooth grooves through basalt, evidence that a single worker could grind for years, wearing both stone and spine thin. Some skeletons of female workers even showed distinctive arthritis patterns, the fossilized ache of daily bread. A lesser-known tidbit: ground flour often had traces of tiny stone particles, the price of such effort. Over time, eating that gritty bread ground down teeth. If you were ancient Egyptian, you might end your days with a smile full of sandpaper. Dental care wasn't really a thing. The only floss around was linen thread for wrapping mummies. You glance toward the doorway, where Menka, the head baker, stands assessing the day's progress. He's arguing good-naturedly with a young boy carrying sacks of grain. The boy insists the sacks are lighter this season because of a lazy river, meaning the Nile's flood didn't rise as high as usual. Menka snorts. Lazy river. Lazy gods, maybe. Historians still argue whether the Nile's flood cycles were seen as divine mercy or natural rhythm. You suspect the bakers didn't care. They just needed steady grain. Back at the grinding table, someone passes around a clay cup filled with beer. Thin, warm, and slightly sour. Egyptian workers drank it constantly. It was liquid bread, dense with nutrients and, crucially, hydration. The taste isn't great. Think oatmeal that gave up on itself. You sip anyway. It hits your empty stomach with the comfort of habit. The conversation drifts to weather, to grain prices, and, inevitably, to bread itself. Everyone has opinions. One woman swears her cousin's bakery uses too much barley. Another claims emmer gives better color. Menka, overhearing, grins. Bread is bread, he says, unless it's bad bread. Philosophical in his way. You look around, realizing how this simple act, crushing grain, is civilization's backbone. Every temple feast, every pyramid construction crew, every royal ceremony depends on these quiet, rhythmic hands. You imagine a map of Egypt drawn not by borders, but by bakeries, each one a warm dot in the cool desert night. The work slows as the sun climbs. Light slants through narrow windows, catching in clouds of flour. Someone coughs, someone laughs, someone complains that her grinding stone sounds like her husband. You chuckle, earning a few amused glances. Humor is timeless, apparently. For a moment you close your eyes. You can almost feel yourself drifting, lulled by the scraping and shuffling. The repetition is strangely meditative. Even the faint wheeze of the bellows feeding the ovens outside becomes a background lullaby. Then, a sharp sneeze. Flour explodes from your cloth, and everyone within 3 feet laughs. You'll learn, says your teacher kindly. Nobody leaves here clean. You think about that, how history, too, leaves its dust on everyone who touches it. By mid-morning, the first sacks of flour are ready. The workers heft them to their shoulders with practiced grace, carrying them out to the kneading floor. You follow, blinking as sunlight slices into the dim room. Your skin feels coated in chalk. When you brush your arms, the air sparkles with a soft white mist. It's almost beautiful. Menka claps his hands once. Good work, he says. The gods like busy hands. He doesn't mean it metaphorically. Bread making here isn't just work, it's worship. Every grain crushed is an offering, every loaf a prayer that the Nile will flood again next year. You trail behind him as he leads the group toward the mixing tables, the next phase of the ritual. Somewhere in your chest, the steady rhythm of grinding still hums. It's as if the sound lingers in your bones, a slow heartbeat made of stone and patience. You realize you're beginning to relax into their world. The heat, the repetition, the easy humor. It's dusty, yes, but it's also grounding in the truest sense. Every movement has purpose. Every sound connects to the next. As you step outside into the glare, Menka tosses you a grin. Don't breathe too deeply, he warns. You'll bake yourself from the inside out. You laugh, coughing once, because it's not entirely a joke. The flour dust really does seem to warm your lungs. Still, you follow the smell of water and salt ahead, drawn deeper into the alchemy that will turn powder into sustenance, an accident into art. The mixing floor hums like a hive, every worker moving with the slow, practiced rhythm of people who know time doesn't rush in Thebes. It ferments. Great clay basins line the room, each one half filled with pale flour waiting to meet its fate. The air here feels thicker, wetter. You can already sense the next ingredient creeping in, the Nile itself. A young apprentice named Hori hands you a wooden scoop. River water, he says proudly, motioning toward the jars. You peek inside and see that the water isn't exactly clear. It's slightly murky, with tiny flecks of silt and floating bits of straw. You hesitate, but Hori laughs. Good flavor, he insists. The Nile gives everything. You decide not to argue. Egypt's entire civilization would back him up. The process looks simple. Flour, salt, water. But the results depend on instinct, not recipe. There's no measuring, just experience. The kind that comes from decades of guessing correctly. You watch Menka plunge both hands into a basin and start folding the mixture. He's talking to it again, mumbling about the spirit of the grain. It's hypnotic. The slap and stretch of wet dough, the squish between fingers, the steady beat of palms against the table. You follow along, awkwardly mimicking the rhythm, and soon the dough takes shape under your hands. It clings and sighs, reluctant to let go. Too tight, says Menka, pressing his thumb into your mixture. He adds a trickle more water, stirs, nods. There. It listens. Now you realize he's right. The dough does seem to relax, like it's finally exhaling. Somewhere behind you, a jar tips. You hear a splash, followed by a startled curse. An apprentice has spilled half a bucket of water into the wrong basin. Menka groans, but instead of scolding, he kneels beside it, inspecting. The dough bubbles faintly, as if mocking him. He sniffs it, waits, then grins. Maybe the gods are curious, he mutters. And there it is, the accident that changes everything. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptians intentionally used fermentation or simply stumbled upon it. What they agree on is that this bubbling, foaming reaction, wild yeast feeding on sugar, was one of humanity's happiest culinary mistakes. A day's delay in baking, a bowl left covered too long, or a spill of warm water at just the right time. Any of these could have sparked the first rise. Within hours, that ruined dough will swell like breathing lungs, filled with invisible life. You lean over the basin and catch a whiff. Sweet, tangy, alive. Menka shrugs, pretending not to care, but you see the corner of his mouth twitch upward. If it doesn't kill us, he says, maybe it feeds us. The apprentices laugh, relieved. Someone makes a joke about offering the frothy dough to Sobek, the crocodile god, to see if he approves. You imagine a crocodile politely declining bread, perhaps preferring something crunchier. Meanwhile, you notice the bakers mixing in salt, a precious pinch of desert crystal scraped from the Red Sea's edge. It sparkles like powdered moonlight. Salt preserves, strengthens, balances, though none of them could explain why. To them, it's simply good luck in solid form. The room's rhythm picks up again. Dough slaps against tables, hands clap flour into the air, and faint laughter echoes through the heat. It's the sound of accidental science disguised as devotion. You begin to appreciate the strange poetry of it all. Humans discovering chemistry by touch, centuries before knowing what a molecule even was. A mainstream historical fact worth noting: Egyptian wall paintings from around 1450 BCE show bakers kneading dough in these same broad clay tubs, sometimes with their feet when hands grew tired. Archaeologists have found bakeries attached to temples and even royal estates, each one operating like a miniature factory. A quirkier tidbit: bakers sometimes left small charms in their dough for protection. Fragments of faience, beads, tiny amulets, or bits of linen with blessings scrawled in ink. Eating one by accident was apparently very good luck, though probably not great for your dental health. Menka moves through the workers, inspecting. He pats your shoulder approvingly. You learn quickly, he says. The dough likes you. You smile, half embarrassed. He's probably said that to every apprentice since the time of Nama. But it still feels oddly reassuring. The day grows hotter. Sweat drips from your brow and joins the dough in some small act of communal sacrifice. The mixture beneath your hands grows elastic, smooth, warm from the friction. You realize it's alive, not metaphorically, but chemically. The yeast, those wild invisible guests from the air and water, are dining lavishly, exhaling bubbles of carbon dioxide that make the dough rise. No one here knows the word yeast. They call it the breath of Osiris, believing it's divine resurrection at work. The same magic that wakes crops from the soil. You find that strangely beautiful. At the far end of the room, a group of bakers experiment with shapes: flat rounds, small cones, even little animal forms. The creative impulse refuses to sleep. You watch one apprentice roll his dough into the shape of a cat. For Bastet, he explains, she brings good dreams. You promise to remember that next time you can't sleep. A low hum fills the room as someone begins to sing. A slow, repetitive melody about the Nile's generosity. The lyrics are simple, soothing, looping endlessly. You catch the rhythm in your head. Rise, fall, fold, rest. It feels like breathing. You think about how this same song, or something like it, might have echoed here for 1,000 mornings straight. Then comes a moment of quiet. The bowls are covered with damp cloths and set aside. Everyone steps back. Time takes over now. Fermentation is patient work. We wait, says Menka. Good bread likes to dream. You sit beside a window slit, watching the city shimmer under the noon sun. The smell of wet flour fills the room, a scent somewhere between comfort and curiosity. You find your eyelids drooping, lulled by warmth and rhythm. Around you, the bakers chat softly, planning their evening meal. Bread, beer, maybe a handful of lentils. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptian bread was truly fluffy or remained dense and coarse. Either way, the emotional truth holds. It nourished not just the body, but the soul. The act of baking was half craft, half prayer. A fly buzzes lazily over your head, circles the dough, and lands. One apprentice shoos it away with mock solemnity. "Respect the spirit," she scolds. The others laugh quietly. The air itself seems amused. You realize, sitting there with your hands still dusted white, that humanity's great discoveries often arrive like this, by mistake, during an ordinary day, while someone forgets a bowl in the corner. Somewhere deep in that warm, rising dough, history is breathing for the first time. By the time the dough has finished its secret transformation, the air has gone soft with heat. The light outside has turned syrup gold, the kind that sticks to the edges of everything. Inside the bakery, Menka calls for the oven crew. "Fire and clay," he says simply, as though summoning old friends. You follow him into a smaller courtyard. The ground trembles faintly under your sandals, from the heat rolling out of a line of dome-shaped ovens, tabuns. They look like small beehives made of mud and straw, smoke sighing from their mouths. The smell hits you first. Ash, char, and that deep sweetness that comes just before something turns perfect. Menka gestures toward the pits where fuel is stacked. No clean wood here, just dried dung, chaff, and reeds. The river feeds the field feeds the fire, he says almost proudly. You crouch beside one oven, watching a young boy poke at the embers with a stick. Sparks drift up and vanish like tiny stars. You can feel the heat in your teeth. A mainstream fact you recall. Archaeologists have uncovered bakeries at Deir el Medina and Amana, where ovens like these still stand, scorched black inside. Their layers of soot hold the fingerprints of the last bakers who worked them. Tiny whorls pressed into clay thousands of years ago. You wonder if Menka's prints are fossilizing here, too, one loaf at a time. The crew begins feeding the ovens. The air fills with a low roar, and Menka crouches to test the temperature the old way, by sticking his arm inside for half a second. He judges the heat by pain, the original thermometer. "Good," he grunts. "Hot enough to anger the gods, but not enough to burn their bread." You help carry the risen dough from the shade. It feels light now, swollen and buoyant. The bakers cut it into portions with bronze blades that gleam in the firelight. Each piece lands on a palm, then onto a flat clay pan sprinkled with flour. The motions are so fluid you start to relax into them. The first loaf goes in. Menka uses a long paddle to stick it to the inside wall of the oven, then seals the mouth with a clay slab. Time stretches. The smell begins. First sharp, then sweet, then utterly comforting. You could fall asleep standing up, lulled by that aroma alone. But the day is far from restful here. Across the courtyard, a pot cracks, too thin, baked too fast. The apprentice responsible winces. Menka chuckles. "Every loaf teaches patience," he says, "and sometimes breaks a pot to make its point." That's your quirky tidbit for the day. Egyptians sometimes used the same clay for baking pots as for building bricks, which meant an unlucky batch of pottery could end up tasting faintly of yesterday's walls. Some historians think that's why ancient bread occasionally carried a gritty crunch. One bite of house included at no extra cost. The ovens rumble softly, and you can almost hear the transformation happening inside. The hiss of steam, the crackle of crust, the murmur of heat changing dough into something worthy of worship. You close your eyes and imagine microscopic armies of yeast dying nobly in service of flavor. It's oddly poetic in a morbid way. A thin crack appears in one oven wall, and Menka frowns. "Too dry," he mutters. She's angry today. He smears wet clay over the fissure, sealing it. Historians still argue whether these repairs were daily chores or sacred rituals. In practice, they're both. When you rely on earth to feed you, you treat it gently. The boy tending the fires fans the flames again. More heat, you ask. Always more. He grins, sweat streaking his face. Bread likes drama. You laugh softly. The line feels true beyond the bakery. The first loaf emerges, golden brown with darker edges, steam curling up like incense. Menka taps it with his knuckles. The hollow sound makes everyone smile. He breaks it open, revealing a crumb shot through with bubbles, tiny chambers of air that didn't exist before this morning's mistake. You inhale deeply. The scent is toasty, sour, alive. He passes pieces around. You bite in. The crust snaps. The inside is tender. It's not soft like modern bread. It has character, texture, a bit of sand maybe, but it's delicious. You understand why the Egyptians called bread life itself. As more loaves bake, the courtyard becomes a warm constellation of movement. Bakers carry trays, apprentices dust flour over their arms, the fires pulse, the rhythm returns, the ancient percussion of survival. It's a little chaotic, a little musical. You begin to sway without realizing. Somewhere nearby, a scribe from the temple enters, holding a wooden tablet. He's here to record the bread count for offerings. 30 loaves for the temple, 15 for the workers, 10 for the gods, he announces. Menka rolls his eyes. The gods never eat theirs, he mutters. We could save time. You picture a celestial audit someday. An annoyed god flipping through tablets, missing 10 loaves again. The thought makes you grin. Even bureaucracy can't escape humor. In the far corner, a woman pulls a small lump of overbaked dough from her oven. Instead of tossing it, she grinds it into powder. Flavor, she explains. You realize she's inventing toasted flour, another happy accident, another layer of history baked in. The sun tilts west. Shadows stretch across the yard, long and honey-colored. The ovens cool to a steady glow, their mouths ringed with ash. Menka wipes his hands on his apron and sighs. Tomorrow, he says, we start again. Same bread, new mistakes. You linger as the others carry trays inside. The smell of baked grain clings to your hair, to your skin, to memory itself. The heat softens into something gentle. You think about how many mornings, centuries, lives have followed this exact rhythm. Fire, clay, mistake, perfection. Historians still argue whether Egyptian baking inspired later Mediterranean techniques or evolved in isolation. Standing here, you feel like the debate misses the point. The real story isn't about who copied whom. It's about the calm beauty of repetition, of learning by error, of turning accident into art. The last ember pops softly, and a hush settles. You reach toward the oven's cracked surface, feeling its fading warmth under your fingertips. The clay is rough, but the heat is kind. Somewhere deep inside, another loaf finishes its quiet metamorphosis. You inhale once more, slow and deep, and the scent of smoke and sweetness fills your lungs. It's the oldest comfort there is, the smell of survival. The courtyard hums with leftover warmth as you help Menka carry the best loaves to the temple kitchens. The light now is soft and honey-thick, settling over Thebes like a blanket. Every alley smells faintly of smoke, yeast, and Nile water. A procession of workers passes by, balancing baskets of bread on their heads, offerings destined for the pharaoh's priests. Careful, Menka warns. The gods like neat loaves. You grin, wondering if the gods have opinions on crust color too. The path to the temple is lined with sandstone walls carved deep with hieroglyphs. Each step echoes slightly, your sandals slapping against the stone in a rhythm that feels ancient yet familiar. Inside, the temperature drops and the smell changes. Less smoke, more incense. The air vibrates faintly with chanting from distant halls. You enter the bakery annex attached to the temple of Amun. Here, the bakers wear cleaner linen and fewer smiles. Everything gleams. Polished copper bowls, fresh reed mats, even the flour sacks stacked like miniature pyramids. The temple kitchens aren't just about food. They're a performance. Each loaf baked here will travel from altar to offering plate to the pharaoh's own table. Menka nudges you. Smile, he whispers. Priest-like smiles. Makes them think you're blessed. At the far end, a tall man in immaculate white robes stands inspecting a tray of bread like a jeweler studying gems. This is the chief temple baker, Paza. He eyes you and Menka, nodding once. The palace requested extra loaves today, he says, for the pharaoh's breakfast. You feel a flutter of nervous amusement. The pharaoh's breakfast. You're about to contribute to the most royal of carb-loading events. Does he eat much bread? You ask quietly. Menka snorts. He eats what the priests tell him to, same as the rest of us. You notice how serious everyone becomes as the loaves are arranged on golden trays. They're shaped differently here, more symmetrical, smoother, like small suns. Each bears a mark pressed by a carved stamp, a tiny ankh, the sign of life. These aren't just loaves, they're theology with crusts. Mainstream historians note that temple bread was a spiritual offering before it was food. Bakers like these made hundreds of varieties, some for daily rituals, others for festivals. But only a small fraction would ever be eaten by humans. Most were left on altars until stale, then quietly recycled into beer mash, or occasionally reissued as new offerings. Efficiency, ancient style. Your quirky tidbit. Some priests were so particular that they banned bread baked by menstruating women, fearing impurity. Yet others swore that the monthly bakers produced lighter loaves, divine irony at its finest. You can't help but smile at the thought of ancient theological bake-offs. As the trays are carried deeper into the temple, you follow, passing painted scenes of gods feasting. There's Hathor with her cow horns, smiling dreamily, Osiris breaking bread beside fields of green grain. Even Ra, sun disk glowing, lifting a cup of beer. You imagine them arguing politely about crust thickness. The pharaoh's breakfast is laid in a small, shaded courtyard, near a pool of lotus flowers. Servants set out dates, honey, figs, and bread still warm from your hands. The scent is intoxicating, a mingling of sweetness and smoke. A young attendant appears with a nervous expression. The royal taster will arrive soon, he says. You glance at Menka, who smirks. Poor man, he whispers, eats everything, enjoys nothing. Historians still argue whether royal taste testers truly existed or were just ceremonial. What's clear is that paranoia came standard with a crown. You picture the pharaoh eyeing his meal suspiciously, wondering if someone spiced the dough with ambition. You and Menka wait quietly as a small group of priests inspect the spread. Their conversation drifts to divine symbolism, how bread represents rebirth, how its shape mirrors the rising sun. You half listen, your mind drifting to the heat of the ovens earlier, the hiss of dough meeting clay. You realize this simple act, baking, has threaded itself into religion, politics, and poetry. When the taster finally arrives, he's a wiry man with tired eyes. He bows to the priest, takes a small piece of your bread, and chews. The courtyard falls silent. You watch him swallow. A pause. Then he nods. Acceptable. The priests exhale in relief. Menka winks. You see, he whispers, the gods approve. The taster moves on, sampling dates and honey. You feel a flicker of pride. Your dough, your hands, your little accidental yeast experiment, now part of Pharaoh's breakfast. Not bad for a day's work, but there's more to deliver. The rest of the bread is destined for workers, guards, scribes, ordinary mouths in need of sustenance. You help load baskets onto donkeys, while temple children chase each other through the courtyard. One of them steals a crust and darts away, laughing. Menka shrugs. Even the gods forgive hungry children. A shaft of light cuts across the courtyard floor, illuminating floating motes of flour in the air. It feels almost holy, the way everything slows down for a moment. The chanting, the laughter, the wind stirring the lotus pool. You realize that perfection here isn't about precision, but devotion. Every loaf carries a piece of the river, the field, the fire, and the hand that shaped it. Historians still argue whether Egyptian bakers thought of themselves as artisans or laborers. Watching Menka's quiet satisfaction, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. They weren't chasing innovation, they were chasing continuity. Bread wasn't invention, it was inheritance. A soft bell rings somewhere deep inside the temple. The priests begin another chant, low and rhythmic, and for a moment you feel like the loaves themselves are joining in, exhaling warmth and incense. As the ceremony ends, Menka hands you a small, slightly overbaked loaf. Keep it, he says, for luck, or breakfast. You tug it into your satchel, still warm against your side. You walk back toward the bakery as dusk begins to paint the city bronze. The temple fades behind you, the river hums nearby, and the sky smells faintly of coming night. Your stomach grumbles softly. You smile, realizing that, divine or not, bread always finds its way back to the hungry. Evening settles over Thebes in a golden hush. You can almost hear the city exhale after the long heat of the day. The loaves meant for the temple are cooling, and the scent of roasted grain drifts lazily through the air, sweet, smoky, and somehow timeless. You follow Menka toward a quieter corner of the bakery, where older women sit cross-legged beside baskets lined with linen. Inside those baskets rest perfectly shaped loaves, some still steaming, others dry and pale as sandstone. These, Menka murmurs, are for the dead. The words hang softly between you. You kneel beside the nearest basket and peer inside. The loaves are smaller, rounder, with tiny impressions of lotus petals on top. Someone has brushed them with honey to make them shine. They'll go into tombs, Menka explains. The rich need food for eternity, so we make them something that lasts. You pick one up. It's hard, heavier than you expect. The crust feels like fired clay. It's edible, he says, for about a week. Then it's just memory. A mainstream historical fact. Excavations in royal and noble tombs have uncovered real loaves of bread, some carbonized, some petrified, still tucked beside mummified owners after 4,000 years. They're blackened but intact, shaped like small domes. Scientists have even identified the wheat species used, emmer and barley, the same blend you worked with this morning. A quirkier tidbit. Occasionally, ancient mice found their way into tombs for a midnight snack. Archaeologists have discovered gnawed loaves beside untouched ones, evidence that even eternity has pests. Menka, hearing you mention it, chuckles. Even in the afterlife, he says, there are thieves. The bakers preparing these funerary loaves work in silence, but their motions carry a strange tenderness. One woman dips a brush made of palm fibers into melted honey and sweeps it gently across each crust, humming as she works. The smell of beeswax mingles with the faint sharpness of yeast. You help stack the loaves carefully into reed baskets, each layer separated by linen. Someone sprinkles ground coriander between the layers to keep the bad spirits from nibbling, she says. You wonder if coriander really deters spirits or just mice, but you keep the thought to yourself. Historians still argue whether these offerings were meant as literal food for the soul or symbolic sustenance for gods. To these bakers, it hardly matters. What matters is care. Each loaf will be sealed away in darkness, a quiet promise to the dead. You will not hunger again. The sun sinks lower. Outside, the Nile reflects strips of gold and crimson, like molten glass. A funeral procession drifts by the outer wall, musicians playing slow flutes, mourners scattering petals, a priest chanting words you don't understand. One of the women beside you pauses, bows her head, and whispers a blessing over the loaves. Safe travels, she says, as though the dead might stop by for directions. You glance at Menka. You believe they can eat? He shrugs. If they can dream, they can eat. I hope they taste my bread and think kindly of me. It's such a simple wish, and yet it feels enormous. To bake something so that even the dead might remember you, it's the closest thing to immortality you can imagine. The evening deepens, and lanterns flicker to life around the courtyard. Shadows stretch long and slow. The bakers begin to pack up their tools, wiping flour from arms and faces. The sound of sweeping fills the air, soft, rhythmic, soothing. The ground glitters faintly with stray grains under the torchlight, like spilled stars. One of the younger apprentices, the clumsy one from the morning, is trying to lift a basket that's clearly too heavy. He wobbles, nearly drops it, and Menka rushes over to help. Easy, he laughs. The dead have eternity. They can wait. Everyone chuckles, the tension melting into gentle humor. You take a seat on a low wall, catching your breath. A faint breeze brings the scent of lotus and the distant croak of frogs. For the first time today, you feel the weight of fatigue that only contentment brings. Nearby, Menka pulls a small loaf from his satchel and breaks it in half. For us, he says, handing you a piece, is chewy, slightly sour, with hints of honey. The dead can have theirs tomorrow. You eat in silence, watching the twilight paint the world purple and silver. The sky seems vast enough to swallow every worry. Somewhere, a temple gong sounds, a soft, mellow tone that vibrates in your chest. As the night grows darker, workers carry the funeral loaves toward a waiting barge by the river. You walk with them to the shore, the water glimmering like ink under moonlight. The baskets are loaded carefully beside jars of beer, onions, and small amulets wrapped in cloth. It's an entire picnic for the afterlife. A priest steps forward, his voice low and melodic. He recites the standard invocation. May your bread rise, your beer pour, and your heart never hunger. You catch yourself whispering it along, the words fitting naturally in your mouth. Historians still argue whether the phrase meant literal magic or polite tradition, but as the barge drifts away, you feel something deeper. Continuity, maybe. The living feeding the dead inspiring the living to bake again tomorrow. It's an unbroken circle of giving. When you return to the bakery, the ovens are cooling, their clay sides still radiating warmth. Someone has drawn hieroglyphs in the dust beside them. A loaf, a jar, a rising sun. It's the Egyptian shorthand for life renewed. You run your fingers through the symbols, smudging them slightly, and smile. Menka yawns. Tomorrow we start with fresh water, he says. The old starter is sleeping. You nod, understanding more than you did that morning. Bread here isn't just food. It's time itself, stretching forward and backward with every rise. The moon climbs high over Thebes. You lie back on the cool earth, the scent of baked grain and river reeds wrapping around you like a blanket. Somewhere nearby, The last embers sigh. You listen to them crackle softly, like whispers from the loaves heading into eternity. Morning returns in the way it always does in Thebes. Quiet at first, then bursting to life. You wake to the distant bray of donkeys and the rhythmic slap of wooden sandals on stone. The smell of baking lingers in the air, mingling with the sweetness of the river breeze. You stretch, rub the flour from your hair, and follow the sound of chatter toward the marketplace. The sun is barely up, but the streets are already alive. Stalls of copper pots, baskets of lentils, piles of dates, and coils of fresh fish line the narrow lanes. Children weave through the crowd, carrying bundles of reeds. Bakers shout prices to early customers, while cats prowl beneath tables, opportunistic and shameless. You spot Menka standing near his stall, arms crossed, smiling at the chaos. "You came," he says, handing you a warm loaf wrapped in palm leaves. "Breakfast for my new apprentice." You take a bite. It's sweet, with hints of honey and sesame. "Market day bread," he explains, "always a little showy." The air is thick with noise and smell. You pass a vendor selling beer in small clay jugs, another frying onions in oil. The sound of a reed flute floats above it all. Every now and then, a breeze carries the faint scent of the Nile, muddy, clean, alive. As you walk, you notice a curious thing. Every bakery here has a small offering bowl at its door, a few crumbs of bread, sometimes a splash of beer. You ask Menka about it. "For luck," he says, "and for mice." You blink. "For mice." He grins. "Feed them outside and they don't come in. They're little gods of grain. Best to stay on their good side." A quirky truth. Ancient Egyptians did revere certain animals connected to their livelihoods. Cats, of course, were sacred, but even mice had symbolic weight as creatures of abundance and mischief. Historians still argue whether this was genuine reverence or simply ancient pest management disguised as theology. Either way, it worked. You watch a grey mouse dart from one bowl to another, nabbing a crumb and vanishing under a crate. "See," says Menka, "blessed." The market hums like a hive. Women haggle over barley prices, men stack jars of honey, and somewhere a priest's assistant is loudly proclaiming that the bread blessed by the temple cures back pain. You glance at Menka. "Does it?" He shrugs. "If you believe it does." A light joke follows, but it's hard to tell who's laughing more, you or him. As the sun climbs higher, the heat begins to shimmer off the whitewashed walls. You duck under a woven canopy for shade. A baker nearby fans her oven, muttering curses as a batch burns. "The fire's jealous," Menka says softly, as though explaining the moods of a friend. He points to another stall where a woman sells small decorative loaves shaped like ducks, fish, and tiny lotus flowers. "Festival bread," he says. "You'll see more of that soon." The feast of Opet comes next week. Bread becomes art then. You imagine the scene: bakers sculpting dough into gods and symbols, children trailing behind them with sticky hands. It's a different side of bread, playful and proud. You move through the crowd, catching snippets of conversation. Two farmers argue about grain yields. A scribe boasts about how many loaves he can eat in one sitting. A woman selling honey invites you to taste the sweetness of Hathor. You can't tell if she's flirting or marketing. Either way, you buy a small jar. A mainstream historical fact to ground the chaos. Egyptian markets were regulated by officials called weigher scribes, who ensured fairness in trade. They used scales carved from limestone and recorded prices on small tablets. But as Menka points out, the gods can't measure hunger. Prices still rose and fell like the Nile. You stop at a stall selling figs and dried fish. The merchant gestures toward a loaf with a proud grin. "Baked with Nile mud starter," he says. You're skeptical. Menka laughs and whispers, "That's not a recipe. It's an insult. Means it's over-fermented." You both chuckle, earning a suspicious look from the vendor. As noon approaches, the market grows louder. The sun beats down, and tempers rise with it. Somewhere, a donkey refuses to move. Somewhere else, a baker drops an entire tray of loaves into the dust. The crowd groans in sympathy, then bursts into applause when he laughs it off. "The gods like humility," someone calls out. You find a shaded spot near the riverbank to rest. The water glints gold under the sunlight, boats drifting lazily by, piled high with grain sacks. A small group of children splash at the edge, their laughter carrying through the air. You break off a piece of your bread and toss it toward them. "For the river gods," Menka teases, "or just for ducks?" Historians still argue whether bread in daily Egyptian life was considered sacred or simply essential. But sitting here, you realize it's both. Bread connects every level of society, from pharaoh to fisherman, from priest to pest. It's the shared heartbeat of a civilization. As you lean back, the city hums around you. Chatter, music, haggling, the rhythmic thump of kneading in distant courtyards. It's the same song that played yesterday, and the day before, and the 1,000 years before that. You close your eyes for a moment, feeling the pulse of Thebes sync with your own. When you open them again, the light has softened, and the crowd thins as people retreat for afternoon rest. Menka stands, stretching. "Come," he says. "The festival bread waits for no one." You follow him through the winding alleys, past sleeping cats and shuttered stalls. Behind you, a few last voices call out prices, laughter echoing like ripples in the heat. Ahead, the faint beat of drums begins, slow, distant, like the promise of celebration. The day isn't over. The bread may have risen, but now it will learn to dance. The sound of drums pulls you through Thebes like a thread of heartbeat woven into the air. The feast of Opet has begun, part prayer, part carnival, part sleepless bake-a-thon. Everywhere you look, hands are busy shaping dough into dreams. Menka leads you through a narrow lane that spills suddenly into an open courtyard, bright with banners and laughter. Bakers, potters, and fruit sellers have transformed the square into a kind of edible gallery. Tables are piled high with loaves sculpted into bulls, ibises, and crescent moons. Some gleam with honey glaze, others shimmer with dustings of crushed dates and herbs. The smell is dizzying, a swirl of yeast, smoke, and sweet spice. "Remember," Menka says, handing you a lump of dough. "During Opet, bread becomes prayer. Don't rush it. Let it tell you what shape it wants." You stare at the dough, half expecting it to whisper instructions. Finally, you roll it into a tiny boat, its hull slightly crooked. Menka nods approvingly. "For the journey of Amun down the Nile," he says. "Good choice." A mainstream historical fact fits right here. The Opet festival celebrated the yearly procession of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the divine family, sailing from Karnak to Luxor. Citizens filled the banks with offerings, and bakers made symbolic breads for the occasion. Archaeologists have found molds shaped like sacred boats and sun disk used only during these days. You join the line at the communal oven. The fire roars cheerfully, and each new loaf goes in accompanied by a wish or joke. Someone tosses a dolphin-shaped roll into the heat and shouts, "May it swim all the way to heaven." The crowd laughs. A quirky tidbit floats through the chatter. Some bakers sneak tiny messages inside their festival loaves, small scraps of papyrus with blessings or jokes. You decide to try it, scribbling a quick note on a scrap Menka gives you. "May your next nap last till sunrise." You tuck it into your dough boat's belly and grin. When the loaves emerge, the courtyard erupts in applause. The shapes are imperfect but joyful, some recognizable, others pure imagination. A child holds up a lumpy crocodile loaf. Sobek, she declares proudly. Her mother laughs. More like Sobek after lunch. Menka hands you a flat loaf shaped like the crescent moon. Taste, he says. The crust cracks delicately, the inside soft and faintly sweet from date syrup. Festival dough, he explains. A little sugar for the gods, a little for us. Around you, the celebration expands. Musicians play flutes and drums. Dancers move in lazy circles, their anklets jingling. The air trembles with sound, scent, and sunlight. You breathe it in and feel the weight of the day melt away. At the edge of the square, a group of temple boys balance trays of bread on their heads, heading toward the river procession. The boats wait, decks bright with garlands of papyrus and flowers. The priests chant low prayers, their voices rolling like distant thunder. You and Menka follow the crowd to the water's edge. The river glitters under the afternoon sun, reflecting banners and faces. Bread loaves shaped like suns, and scarabs are placed gently on the boat, offerings to guide the god's journey downstream. The smell of baking gives way to the scent of lotus and smoke. Every year, Menka murmurs, we bake for the gods, and they sail away. Then we wait, and bake again. His voice is calm, almost drowsy. You realize the rhythm of his life, mix, rise, bake, offer, mirrors the Nile's flood cycle, eternal repetition dressed in new shapes each season. Historians still argue whether these festivals were moments of genuine faith or state propaganda designed to remind citizens of divine order. Standing here, watching people laugh, dance, and sneak bites of their sacred loaves, you suspect the truth doesn't care for categories. It's both devotion and delight. As the procession begins, the boats slide away, sails swelling with wind. The crowd cheers, tossing petals and breadcrumbs into the current. The loaves bob briefly on the surface before sinking, carried toward Luxor, like edible prayers. You sit by the bank, letting the noise fade into background hum. Menka opens a clay jug of beer and pours 2 cups. It tastes slightly sour, almost fizzy. The same yeast that lifts bread also livens this drink. The gods invented fermentation, he jokes. We just perfected it. You clink cups in agreement. The evening drapes itself slowly across the sky. Fires flicker, shadows dance. A boy with a painted face wanders past offering moon loaves for a single copper. You buy one. It's warm, dusted with ground sesame, still glowing from the oven. The first bite is all smoke and sweetness. The crowd's energy softens as the stars appear. Families share bread. Traders count their coins. Musicians play slower songs. Someone nearby begins to snore softly against a stack of flour sacks. Menka chuckles. Festival's blessing, he says. Sleep that smells of bread. A stray cat curls beside you, purring. You break off a piece of loaf and offer it. It sniffs, decides against carbs, and leaves with aristocratic disdain. You can't help laughing quietly. Bastet's cousin disapproves, Menka says. A breeze ripples across the river, carrying the distant chanting of priests still aboard the glowing boats. The reflections shimmer like tiny fires dancing on water. You feel your eyelids grow heavy. For a fleeting moment, you imagine you can hear the dough of tomorrow already being kneaded somewhere. The soft slap of hands, the hush of breath, the murmur of prayers. Bread never sleeps. It only rests. Historians still argue whether the first festivals inspired future carnivals across the Mediterranean. To you is simple. This is humanity's oldest lullaby: music, laughter, and the smell of baking at dusk. Menka stretches, yawns, and says, Come back tomorrow. The gods will need breakfast again. You smile, watching the final boat vanish into the twilight. The drums fade to heartbeats. You breathe in the last traces of warmth, the faint sweetness of burnt honey, and let the quiet settle like flour on the surface of the night. Dawn comes wrapped in the hush that follows celebration. Thebes lies still under a pale veil of mist, the Nile whispering softly against its banks. You walk through the nearly empty streets, bare feet brushing against petals left behind from the feast of Opet. It smells faintly of flowers, smoke, and something even gentler, like the cooling crusts of last night's loaves. The bakery is quiet too. The ovens sleep under a thin layer of ash, still warm from yesterday's work. Menka's voice greets you from the shadows. "You're early," he says, amused. "Did the gods wake you?" "Or the cats," you reply, nodding to a trio of them curled on a flour sack. They blink at you, unimpressed. Today, the temple has sent a special request: bread for the royal taste testers. You remember them from before, the unlucky men whose job was to risk their digestion for divine hierarchy. They eat first, so the pharaoh can eat safely, Menka says. But don't feel bad for them. They eat everything. He's right. The testers are both honored and doomed. Constant access to luxury, constant fear of surprise seasoning. You can't help but wonder if any of them ever refused a bite. As you help Menka mix the first batch of dough, he grins. The trick, he says, is to make bread that tastes honest. The pharaoh trusts a man whose loaves are humble. You raise an eyebrow. You think he can tell. Of course, Menka replies. Even kings know the difference between real bread and flattery. The air grows heavy with the familiar scent of wet flour. You start kneading, folding, pressing, stretching, feeling the cool dough come alive beneath your palms. The rhythm returns to your body as if you never stopped. It's almost meditative, like breathing through your hands. As the loaves rise, Menka shows you a new technique, scoring patterns into the dough with a bronze blade. It lets the air escape, he says, tracing gentle lines. And the gods like decoration, makes them think we care. You try your own pattern, simple swirls inspired by the river's flow. Menka nods. Good. Bread should remember water. The Nile gave us the grain. A mainstream historical fact. Egyptian bread often bore carved or pressed designs, flowers, hieroglyphs, even animal prints. Partly decorative, partly practical. The markings helped identify which bakery produced which batch for temple distribution. A system of edible trademarks. Your quirky tidbit for today. In some towns, bakers carved tiny faces into their loaves so they could later identify them in disputes. Archaeologists have unearthed one with a remarkably grumpy expression. Menka laughs when you tell him. Ah, he says, the first Yelp review. While the bread bakes, you join the other workers to prepare a table in the courtyard. The testers will arrive soon, expecting a ceremonial breakfast. Cups of beer are poured, figs arranged, and someone polishes a copper tray until it glows like a small sun. When the loaves emerge from the ovens, the smell is divine. You and Menka line them up neatly. Each loaf glistens with a thin brush of honey glaze, catching the morning light. Pretty enough to risk your life for, Menka jokes. A small procession enters the courtyard. 3 testers, escorted by a scribe and 2 guards. They wear fine linen, though their expressions suggest the job isn't as glamorous as it sounds. One looks perpetually nervous, another bored, and the third far too enthusiastic. The scribe clears his throat. Bread for the pharaoh's morning meal, he announces formally. Menka bows slightly, hiding a smirk. Fresh as sunrise, he says. The testers approach the table. One breaks a loaf carefully, examining the crumb structure as if it holds political secrets. Another sniffs it, then dips a piece into honey. The third just eats it plain, chewing with professional melancholy. You and Menka stand silently, waiting. A bird calls outside. Somewhere, a donkey brays. Finally, the lead tester swallows, nods once, and says, "Acceptable." You can almost hear Menka's suppressed laugh. But then something unexpected happens. The enthusiastic tester picks up your loaf, the one with the swirling pattern, and takes a bite. His eyes widen slightly. "Different," he says. The scribe looks up sharply. "Different how?" "Lighter," the tester replies. "Pleasant. Like river air." Menka glances at you, then grins. "My apprentice has good hands," he says casually. The scribe scribbles something on his tablet, perhaps a note for the palace kitchens. You feel your cheeks warm. The testers continue eating. None collapse dramatically, which you take as a good sign. When they leave, Menka chuckles. "You fed the pharaoh," he says, indirectly. "Congratulations. You're officially part of the royal menu." The morning relaxes again. Workers nibble on the leftover crusts, dipping them in beer or honey. The chatter turns playful. Someone jokes that if the pharaoh ever compliments the bread, he should send a loaf back autographed. Historians still argue whether royal testers were essential protectors or just ceremonial pageantry. Either way, their existence reflects an empire both cautious and indulgent, willing to risk a man's stomach to preserve divine order. As the courtyard empties, Menka leans against the oven, eyes soft with reflection. "We bake for gods, for kings, for the dead, for each other," he says. "But in the end, all bread is eaten the same way, by hand and with hunger." You nod, turning one of the finished loaves in your hands. Its crust gleams, still warm, the scored lines tracing faint rivers of gold. You realize the same dough that began as an accident in a bucket has now fed both commoners and royalty. The sun climbs higher, bright and certain. You look toward the Nile and think of its patient rhythm. Flood, seed, harvest, repeat. Bread follows the same quiet pulse. You close your eyes, letting the warmth seep into your skin, the smell into your memory. Menka tosses you a spare loaf. "Eat before the mice get ideas," he says. You break it open and take a slow bite. The taste is pure comfort. Earth, fire, time. You chew, smile, and decide it's the best breakfast you've ever risked not dying for. The bakery feels quieter today, as if even the ovens are catching their breath. Outside, the streets shimmer under the late morning sun, but inside, cool shadows stretch along the mud brick walls. The scent is familiar. Flour, ash, a whisper of smoke. But there's something else lingering in the air now. Something alive. Menka stands by the corner shelf, staring at a small clay bowl covered with damp linen. He lifts the cloth with a kind of reverence. Beneath it, a lump of dough bubbles lazily, breathing out a faint tangy scent. Warm, sour, alive. You lean closer. The surface trembles ever so slightly, like something dreaming under a blanket. "That," Menka says softly, "is our secret. The heart of every loaf. We call it the mother." You blink. "The mother?" He nods. "A piece of yesterday's dough kept alive for tomorrow. It remembers what the rest forgets. This, you realize, is the starter. The invisible inheritance passed from loaf to loaf day to day. It's alive with wild yeast from the air and the hands that touch it. The bakers feed it each morning with flour and water, whispering to it like a household pet. A mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists and food historians confirm that ancient Egyptian bakers indeed practiced a form of natural leavening, what we'd now call sourdough. They reuse portions of old dough as starters, sustaining yeast cultures for years, perhaps generations. In a way, it was the first instance of biological continuity humans ever nurtured, intentionally. Menka takes a pinch of the bubbling mixture between his fingers and drops it into a new bowl of flour. A little piece keeps everything alive, he says. Never start from nothing. The gods hate waste. You help him mix, stirring in water until the texture feels right. Sticky, elastic, promising. He shows you how to test it, pressing a finger gently into the surface. The dent fills in slowly. It's breathing, he says. Let it rest. Nearby, a young apprentice watches the process like a ceremony. My grandmother had her own mother, she says. When she died, she passed it to my aunt. Still baking. You smile at that. Bread as lineage, yeast as memory. Menka wipes his hands and gestures toward a dark corner. See that jar, he says. Inside sits another starter, older, thicker, crusted around the edges. That one's from my father's father, he explains. We feed it once a week, even if we're not baking. It would be bad luck to let it die. You peer inside and catch a faint whiff of vinegar and thyme. The smell is oddly comforting. This is continuity, you think? Fermentation as family tree. Historians still argue whether this starter tradition was religious ritual or practical knowledge. But in a place where decay and renewal ruled every season, the line between the two hardly mattered. The Egyptians understood that life feeds on what came before. You sit beside the bowl, watching small bubbles bloom and collapse on the surface. It feels oddly meditative, like watching tiny worlds form and vanish. Menka joins you, sitting cross-legged. When the river doesn't rise, this still does, he says. That's hope, in dough form. You can't help but laugh softly. Hope smells a bit sour. He grins. The best things do. A quirky tidbit floats into the conversation. Some bakers claimed their starters had moods. If you insulted the dough or argued in front of it, it would sulk and refuse to rise. One woman swore her husband's bad singing ruined an entire batch. Menka nods knowingly. That's true, he says with absolute seriousness. The mother listens. The apprentices feed the starters, murmuring quietly. It feels like tending a garden, except the soil breathes and the crop never dies. You imagine how many thousands of mornings this ritual has repeated, each baker borrowing life from yesterday to feed today. The oven crackles to life again, small and patient. Menka moves to the fire pit, adjusting reeds and dried dung. You follow, glancing back at the bowl on the shelf. The dough shifts almost imperceptibly, as though stretching in its sleep. Menka catches you looking. You'll see, he says. In a few hours, it doubles. Then we thank it. Thank it? Of course, he says. You never eat without gratitude. You watch him stir the embers, and your mind drifts. Gratitude. That's what this whole process has been from the start. Grinding, kneading, waiting, baking. It's all a long, slow thank you note to the earth. As the morning warms, Menka begins shaping new loaves. You help, dusting flour on the boards, folding the dough over itself until it springs lightly under your fingers. The new mixture, fed with yesterday's mother, rises faster, stronger. You can feel the difference. A faint breeze slips through the doorway, carrying the scent of the Nile and faraway incense from the temple. It mingles with the tang of fermentation. You breathe it in, a strange mix of earth, life, and something nearly holy. You remember the first day you stepped into this bakery, the noise, the heat, the chaos. Now it feels slower, deeper. You've learned the rhythm beneath the clamor. Every rise and fall mirrors the breath of the city itself. Menka wipes his brow. This starter, he says, tapping the bowl gently, will outlive us. Maybe one day, someone will still be feeding it, still baking. They'll never know our names, but they'll taste us. You sit in silence for a while, watching the fire's slow dance. The idea feels enormous and comforting all at once, that a piece of you might live in someone's daily bread, centuries from now. Historians still argue whether modern sourdoughs trace their ancestry to these ancient cultures, but the debate feels irrelevant as you listen to the soft bubbling in the clay bowl. This, right here, is the beginning of flavor, memory, and continuity, a small, breathing miracle. Outside, a bell rings, calling workers to the midday meal. The apprentices rush off, laughing, but you and Menka linger. He lowers the cloth back over the bowl with the care of someone tucking in a child. "Let her sleep," he says quietly. "She's dreaming of tomorrow's bread." You nod, smiling as the heat settles around you. The ovens sigh, the dough rises, and time keeps folding itself over like soft dough in gentle hands. The day moves lazily, as if time itself has eaten too much bread. The smell of fermenting dough fills the bakery, rich and tangy, almost musical in its rhythm. You can hear it if you listen closely. The faint popping of bubbles, the sticky sigh as the dough stretches against the linen. It's afternoon now, and the light slants through the high windows, turning the flour in the air into glitter. Everyone moves slower in this heat. The apprentices wipe sweat from their brows. The cats nap in flour baskets, and Menka leans against a pillar, half dozing. You sit beside the rising dough, mesmerized by its quiet motion. Then the whispering begins. Not from the dough, though honestly, you wouldn't be surprised, but from the bakers. A few have gathered in a loose circle near the oven, talking in low, conspiratorial tones. You drift closer. "They say the dough breathes because of Osiris," one woman murmurs. "It's his spirit returning through the grain." Another shakes her head. "No, it's swamp air. My uncle says bubbles come from marsh gases." Menka cracks an eye open. "Swamp gases," he mutters. "Tell your uncle to bake in a swamp, then see if his loaves rise." The group laughs softly, and someone tosses a crumb at him in mock protest. The debate continues. Divine breath versus natural reaction. It's half theology, half curiosity, and entirely Egyptian. A mainstream historical fact, Egyptians associated fermentation with divine rebirth. The bubbling dough was often linked to Osiris, the god who died and rose again, much like the grain that sprouted from the soil after flooding. Bread was more than food. It was a symbol of resurrection. A quirkier tidbit. One ancient baker's inscription found near Thebes refers to himself as the servant who feeds the breath of the gods. Historians can't decide whether that was humble devotion or bragging rights for a particularly fluffy loaf. Menka stands, stretching. "The dough breathes because it's alive," he says simply. "You don't need gods to see that." Then, with a grin, "But the gods do like to take credit." You chuckle. And historians still argue about which came first. "Historians," he says, squinting. "Are they bakers?" "Not exactly." He waves a hand dismissively. "Then what do they know about bread?" The laughter that follows is easy, light, but beneath it, you feel something profound. Every culture, every generation, invents its own explanations for mystery. Whether you call it yeast or Osiris, the wonder remains. You help the group transfer the dough to the long tables for shaping. It's soft, warm, full of tiny air pockets like captured sighs. Each baker takes a handful, folding it over itself with practiced grace. The movement feels like choreography: press, turn, fold, rest. Someone begins humming a slow tune, and soon the others join in. The song's words are simple: praise for the grain, thanks for the river, a wish for gentle weather. It's hypnotic, the kind of melody that seeps into your breathing until you're part of it. You realize something strange. You're no longer thinking about the process, just feeling it. The dough seems to move with you, as though your heartbeat sets its tempo. For a brief, drowsy moment, you almost believe the divine breath theory yourself. Menka breaks the trance with a clap. "All right," he says, "enough worship. Let's see if the gods approve." He gestures toward the ovens, where the fire glows low and steady. The bakers slide their shaped loaves inside, one by one. You can smell the shift almost immediately, the sharp tang of yeast giving way to toasty warmth. The air thickens with aroma, and everyone relaxes. There's nothing more to do now but wait. Waiting becomes its own ritual. The bakers sprawl on mats, sipping beer and gossiping softly. Someone tells a joke about a scribe who wrote love poems to his favorite bread. Another swears she saw a loaf rise so perfectly last week that it stood taller than a priest's hat. You laugh along, the stories turning sillier as the minutes pass. The ovens hum quietly behind you, radiating comfort. When Menka finally pulls the first loaf free, it's perfect, golden, glossy, split just enough along the top to show its soft, steaming heart. He holds it up for everyone to see. "The gods have good lungs today," he says. You tear off a piece and taste. It's richer than before. Tangy, deep, alive in a way you can't quite explain. Maybe it's the old starter. Maybe it's Osiris. Maybe it's both. Outside, the sun has turned red, staining the courtyard with warmth. A cool breeze stirs through the doorway, and the smell of fresh bread spills into the streets. You hear faint laughter from children passing by, drawn by the scent. One peeks in shyly. Menka tosses her a small roll. She catches it, grinning, and disappears. Historians still argue whether ancient bakeries like this served the community directly or only supplied temples and officials. Judging by Menka's generosity, it's clearly both. Bread isn't just currency, it's kindness. The day winds down slowly. The apprentices begin cleaning, scraping the tables, sweeping flour into neat piles, covering the leftover dough with cloth. The rhythmic swish of brooms and crackle of cooling ovens fill the space with soft white noise. You lean against the doorway, watching the light fade. The bakery smells of smoke, laughter, and history. Menka joins you, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the distant river. "Funny thing," he says quietly. "No one remembers the names of bakers. Just kings and scribes. But if the bread stopped..." He trails off, smiling faintly. "Even the gods would go hungry." You nod. Maybe they remember you differently. In every good loaf. He looks at you for a long moment, then chuckles. "You've been spending too much time near the dough. It's made you poetic." The first star appears above the horizon. Somewhere, someone begins singing the same harvest tune from earlier, softer now, slower. You close your eyes listening. The rhythm feels eternal. Rise and fall, creation and rest, life and breath. Behind you, the ovens sigh as their fires die down. The last glow fades to embers, and in the quiet, you swear you can still hear the dough exhale one final, contented breath. The morning light returns thin and silvery, filtering through a haze of flour that hangs in the air like fog. You wake to the familiar chorus of Thebes beginning its day. Roosters, merchants, donkeys, and the rhythmic slap of kneading in the distance. Today, Menka decides it's time to trace bread back to its roots. "You've seen the ovens," he says. "Now you should see where the loaves begin." You follow him out of the city, along a narrow path that winds toward the green fringe of the Nile. The river glitters under the pale sun, wide and slow as thought itself. On its banks, fields of barley and emmer wheat sway like golden seas. The air smells of wet earth and new life. This, Menka says, spreading his arms, is where every loaf begins and ends. The gods give the flood, we give the work. His tone is both matter-of-fact and reverent, the way farmers speak when they know nature can be generous or cruel. A mainstream historical fact, Egyptian agriculture depended entirely on the Nile's annual flooding. Each inundation left behind black silt, rich, perfect soil for grain. When the waters receded, farmers planted by hand, their seeds tossed into the soft mud. Months later, the harvest would fill the granaries that fed the entire kingdom. You walk through the rows of grain, the stalks brushing against your arms. The sound they make is whispery and soothing, like waves against sand. The farmers here wear simple linen kilts, their skin darkened by the sun, their hands rough from scythes. They move methodically, cutting the stalks, tying them in bundles, stacking them high on wooden sledges. Menka greets them like family. Without them, he says, there's no us. Bakers talk about the gods, but these are the real ones. You kneel to pick up a fallen stalk. The kernels are small, hard, and golden. Emma, Menka tells you, she's stubborn. Takes twice the work to mill, but she gives good flavor. Barley's easier, but too humble for temples. He chuckles. Even bread has class. As you help gather the sheaves, you realize the rhythm here is the same as in the bakery. Steady, repetitive, almost hypnotic. There's music in the motion, a pulse that ties one task to the next. The farmers hum under their breath, old songs about flood and sun, about Ra's journey across the sky. The melody feels ancient, older than writing, older than words. A quirkier tidbit. Egyptian harvesters often use sickles, lined with sharpened flint, and some would decorate the handles with carved prayers to ensure abundant yield. Archaeologists have found these tools buried with their owners. Proof that even in death, they expected to keep working the fields of eternity. When the carts are full, you follow Menka to a small clearing where women spread the grain to dry. They toss it with wide, graceful arcs, letting the breeze carry away the chaff. The sunlight catches the falling husks, turning the air into glitter. You can't help but smile. The Nile's snow, Menka says softly. You sit beside the grain piles, watching the rhythm of tossing and catching. The sound of wooden scoops, the hum of insects, the whisper of wind. It all blends into something almost like a lullaby. The farmers' children chase each other nearby, their laughter carrying over the fields. It's peaceful, grounding. Menka takes a handful of grain and lets it run through his fingers. Every loaf, he says, remembers this sound. He closes his eyes briefly, listening. Even when I'm baking in the temple, I can hear it. Historians still argue whether bakers like Menka maintained direct ties to the farmlands or worked entirely under temple distribution. But watching him move among the farmers, you sense there's no real separation. Grain, flour, bread, it's all one long breathing system. The workers rest under a date palm, passing around clay jugs of beer and bowls of lentils. You join them, tearing off a piece of leftover bread from your satchel. It's dry, but somehow perfect in this setting. A farmer's wife offers you a handful of roasted chickpeas in exchange. You trade with a smile. For a moment, you simply exist. No ovens, no priests, no gods. Just sun, grain, and the steady pulse of life. You can almost feel the city exhaling through you, the same way the dough does when it rises. As the day wanes, the harvested grain is loaded onto boats that will drift down the Nile toward the city's granaries. You and Menka watch as they push off, the water rippling gold in the light of the sinking sun. The boats creak softly, their hulls full of tomorrow's bread. Everything returns, Menka says. The river floods, the fields feed, the ovens burn, the loaves rise. Then we start again. He looks at you with a sleepy grin. If that's not eternity, what is? You walk back toward Thebes, under a sky deepening into violet. The sounds of evening rise, frogs croaking, waterbirds calling, distant laughter from the riverbank. The first stars begin to appear. You feel the heat of the day leaving your skin, replaced by a cool whisper of night air. By the time you reach the bakery, the ovens glow faintly in the dark, like guardian spirits waiting patiently. Menka pats one affectionately. She missed us, he says. Tomorrow we feed her again. You stand beside him, the scent of baked earth and river mud blending into something oddly sweet. The moon catches in the flour dust still clinging to your arms. You realize that every motion, grinding, kneading, baking, connects back to this single truth. The earth feeds itself endlessly. Historians still argue whether Egyptian bread making was more art or agriculture, but here, on this warm night, you know it's both. The farmer, the baker, and the eater are all just different hands on the same body. As Menka begins stacking firewood for tomorrow, you sit on the cool threshold and listen. Somewhere out in the fields, the crickets sing in soft, rhythmic waves. Their song matches the steady breath of the ovens, the rise and fall of the river. Everything you realize is leavened by patience. Morning light creeps along the bakery's walls, touching baskets of flour and jars of honey with a soft, golden glow. You're kneading quietly when Menka bursts in with a grin. Guests, he says, traders from far south. They bring new spices and strange bread. You follow him outside into the courtyard, where a small group of travelers waits beside their donkeys. They wear bright linen robes and carry baskets wrapped in woven mats. The smell hits you before the sight does, a swirl of cinnamon, roasted nuts, and something faintly floral. From Nubia, Menka whispers. They travel with the river, same as we do, only longer. The leader of the traders, a tall woman with a smooth-shaven head and steady eyes, steps forward and opens a basket. Inside are loaves darker than any you've seen, their crusts shiny with oil, their tops sprinkled with crushed dates. Honey bread, she says in careful Egyptian. We make it for journeys. Lasts weeks. You take one piece and bite. The texture is firm but tender, and the taste, rich, almost smoky, with a sweetness that deepens as you chew. Menka's eyebrows lift. The gods would eat this before ours, he admits. The woman laughs, clearly pleased. A mainstream historical fact, Egypt's trade routes with Nubia and beyond the Red Sea brought not only gold and incense, but also new foods and flavors: cinnamon, myrrh, honey, and even early forms of sesame and nuts. Bakers adapted quickly, blending foreign tastes into local rituals. Some scholars believe the first spice breads in the Mediterranean began along these very routes. You gesture toward your ovens. Would you like to bake with us? The traders exchange amused glances. Your fire, our dough, the woman says. Let's see who the gods prefer. Soon the courtyard becomes a lively experiment. Menka's apprentices bring out bowls and water. The Nubian traders mix their dough, adding oil and fruit instead of the usual barley or emmer blend. You can feel the mood lighten, laughter crossing languages, gestures replacing words. One man hums a song with a strange rhythm, and Menka tries to mimic it, off-key but enthusiastic. A quirky tidbit to note. In some regions of Nubia, bakers patted their loaves into shape using a specific rhythm, believing the sound helped the dough remember joy. When you try it yourself, the beat feels comforting. like drumming a lullaby into the bread. The first batch bakes quickly. The smell changes the whole mood of the street. Neighbors poke their heads out, drawn by curiosity and hunger. Even the cats seem more alert. When the loaves emerge, darker and glossier than the pale Egyptian ones, everyone crowds around. Menka cuts one open. The inside glows a deep amber from the honey. He takes a bite, chews thoughtfully, and declares, "Too sweet." The traders laugh again. "Too serious," the woman fires back. "Bread can smile too. You try a piece yourself. It's incredible, sweet but layered with roasted flavor from the oil." "This tastes like sunlight," you say, and the traders nod approvingly. As everyone eats, the talk turns to trade. The Nubians tell stories of their journeys, of river crossings under starlight, of mountains where incense trees grow, of markets where gold dust and pepper are weighed on the same scales. Menka listens, fascinated. "So much distance for bread," he says, "and yet it tastes like home." Historians still argue how much cultural exchange flowed along these early trade routes. Some claim Egyptian techniques spread south. Others say inspiration moved north. Standing here, watching the shared laughter over a cooling loaf, you realize the question doesn't matter. The river carries knowledge both ways. As the sun climbs higher, the traders prepare to leave. The woman wraps several loaves in palm leaves and offers them to Menka. "For your journey," she says. He bows deeply. "And for yours," he replies, handing her a basket of temple bread. "Ours may not smile," he adds, "but it keeps well." Before they depart, one of the apprentices asks shyly for a bit of their spice. The woman laughs and tosses him a small pouch. "Cinnamon," she says. "Add a pinch next time you bake for love." The boy blushes crimson, prompting more laughter. When the traders finally lead their donkeys toward the river, their songs linger in the air long after they've vanished. The scent of honey bread remains too, clinging to the courtyard walls. Menka breaks the silence. "Maybe tomorrow we try mixing it," he says. "A little of theirs, a little of ours. If it offends the gods, we'll blame you." You grin. "Deal." He chuckles and sits on a stone bench, chewing thoughtfully on a leftover crust. "You know," he says, "bread travels faster than people. You give it to someone and they pass it along. Soon it's everywhere, like a rumor the gods forgot to stop." You sit beside him, the heat settling like a soft blanket. The afternoon hums with flies and distant chatter. The ovens are cooling again, their embers faint and red. You can almost hear the whisper of the river beyond the walls, carrying boats toward lands you can barely imagine. Historians still argue whether these exchanges shaped later culinary empires or simply flavored Egypt's golden age. But sitting here, belly full and hands dusted with flour, you know that every borrowed flavor, every shared loaf, is another way humans say the same quiet thing. "We survived today. Let's eat." Menka stands, brushing off his hands. "Enough philosophy," he says. "If I sit any longer, I'll turn into dough myself." He gestures toward the oven. "Come on, let's bake something that might just make the gods jealous." You smile, rising to help. The scent of honey still sweet in the air. The river sings softly beyond the city, carrying stories, flavors, and the faint echo of laughter that sounds suspiciously like rising dough. The next morning begins in an unusual hush. The market is still, the ovens cold. The only sound is the low whisper of wind stirring the flour, dust left behind from yesterday's baking. Menka stands by the door, polishing a clay mixing bowl, as though preparing for a quiet ceremony. "Today," he says, "we bake for the scribes." You blink. "Scribes?" He nods. "They're writing something about bread, again." They love to argue about what makes a loaf worthy of offering, so we give them one to argue over. He says this without bitterness, but you catch the flicker of amusement in his eyes. Scribes and priests might write the rules of daily life, but bakers like Menka know the truth hides in the heat and the grain. You begin mixing the dough as the city slowly wakes. The air is cooler today, a faint breeze carrying the smell of wet clay and papyrus ink from the temple quarter. The kneading feels automatic now. Your hands know the rhythm before your mind does. The dough, fed by yesterday's starter, rises eagerly, stretching toward life. Menka watches you work. Every batch has its own mood, he says. Yesterday's dough was bold, today's is shy. He presses his palm to it gently. She'll need time. As you wait for the rise, a small group of scribes arrives, robes immaculate, fingers stained with ink. They carry tablets and styluses, their eyes darting around like birds. One introduces himself as Paheri, temple recorder of offerings. He bows politely. We've been instructed, he says, to describe the properties of perfect bread. Menka's smile is thin but kind. Bread doesn't have properties, he says. It has patience. The scribes exchange uneasy looks, then begin their inspection. They note the color of the flour, the thickness of the crust, the aroma from the starter bowl. One of them writes furiously, his lips moving as he whispers to himself. A mainstream historical fact, in several ancient papyri, such as the Ramesside lists of temple inventories, scribes recorded hundreds of bread types, each with precise names, shapes, and ceremonial uses. Some loaves were for offerings, others for soldiers, others for feasts. It was a taxonomy of sustenance, an edible library. A quirkier tidbit, one surviving document describes bread that talks, a poetic way of referring to loaves that crackled audibly as they cooled. The sound, some scribes claimed, was the dough praising its maker. Your batch begins to do just that, crackling softly in the warm air. The scribes freeze mid-sentence. It speaks, one whispers reverently. Menka raises an eyebrow. Of course it does. It's complaining that you're watching it too much. The apprentices stifle laughter. The scribes, uncertain whether they're being mocked, write faster. You can see their tablets filling with tiny lines of script. Baker Menka of Thebes claims loaves speak when content. When the dough is ready, Menka gestures for you to shape it. You press and fold, forming smooth round loaves, each with a slight twist at the top. Menka calls them wind loaves. They trap air, he explains quietly, so when they bake, they remember the sky. You brush the tops with water and sprinkle a thin layer of ground barley for texture. The scribes lean in close, noting every step. How long will they bake? One asks. Until they're done, Menka says dryly. The ovens roar to life again, their mouths glowing orange. You slide the loaves in carefully, feeling the sudden pulse of heat on your face. The air fills with that irresistible scent, nutty, sharp, comforting. The scribes wait at a respectful distance, their pens momentarily still. You can tell the smell has reached them. One of them sighs audibly. Menka catches your eye, smirking. Words can't taste, he murmurs. When the loaves emerge, perfectly golden, the scribes swarm closer, taking notes like scholars at a sacred ritual. Paheri cuts one open and examines the crumb with exaggerated seriousness. Even structure, he notes. Fragrance, divine. Flavor. He hesitates, takes a bite, and closes his eyes. Transcendent. The apprentices exchange amused looks. Menka bows slightly. The dough thanks you for your poetry. Historians still argue whether these temple food records were acts of devotion or early attempts at culinary science. To you, it feels like both, a collision between precision and wonder. The scribes see numbers and categories. The bakers feel heartbeat and breath. The inspection continues for hours. They measure, they describe, they debate. One insists that round loaves are more divine because they resemble the sun. Another argues that tall loaves better symbolize eternity. Menka, unfazed, offers them both more bread and says, "Why not eat both and see which tastes holier?" Eventually, satisfied or too full to continue, the scribes gather their tablets and prepare to leave. Before they go, Pahiri turns back to you. "We will write of this day," he says solemnly. "Your loaves will be remembered in record." You smile, knowing that ink fades, but the smell of bread does not. After they leave, Menka chuckles. "Scribes," he says, "always writing about what they can't do. If they could bake, they'd stop talking." You both laugh, and the tension of the morning evaporates. The ovens cool slowly, their clay sides radiating a drowsy heat. The apprentices sweep the floors, humming softly. One starts a quiet rhythm on an empty basket, a gentle beat that fills the silence. You lean against the wall, chewing on a leftover heel of bread. Its crust crackles faintly with each bite. You close your eyes and listen to the sound. Maybe it really is talking. A soft murmur of satisfaction, a sigh of survival. Menka glances over. "Hear that?" he says. "That's what we call success." The day wanes. Shadows lengthen across the courtyard, and a flock of white egrets flies overhead, their wings flashing like scraps of cloth in the fading light. The smell of cooling bread mingles with the distant scent of ink and papyrus from the temple quarter. Historians still argue whether ancient bread-making was an art of the people or an extension of state religion. Watching Menka stretch his arms and grin at his ovens, you suspect it's something even simpler. It's the art of paying attention, to heat, to time, to life rising quietly when no one's watching. As twilight settles over Thebes, the last crumbs are brushed from the tables, and the bakery falls into gentle silence. The ovens glow softly, like hearts that refuse to go out. Somewhere, faintly, you can still hear the loaves crackling. Maybe they really are talking after all. Night unfolds slowly over Thebes, the kind of soft darkness that carries the smell of dust and memory. You stand in the doorway of the bakery, the day's last warmth fading from the clay walls. The air hums faintly, the distant croak of frogs near the river, the quiet rustle of palm leaves in the breeze, the crackle of one stubborn ember that refuses to die. Menka is there beside you, as always, a silhouette against the fading glow of the ovens. "The fire's getting old," he murmurs. "She's tired." You hand him a reed fan, and he gives the coals a lazy stir. Sparks drift upward like tiny fireflies, rise for a breath, then vanish into the dark. The smell of cooling bread surrounds you, smoky, earthy, faintly sweet. You know it now, the way one knows a friend's voice in a crowd. The ovens sigh, the bricks ticking as they contract. You can almost feel the heartbeat of the place slow down. "Tomorrow," Menka says, "we bake again. The pharaoh will still be hungry. The priests will still want offerings. The river will still run." He gives a half smile, "and will still be covered in flour." You laugh softly, then glance at the shelves lined with loaves cooling in neat rows. They look almost like sleeping faces, peaceful, unhurried. "What happens to these?" you ask. "Some go to the workers," Menka says. "Some to the temples. Some we keep for trade." He pauses, tapping one of the loaves gently. "A few are just for remembering." He takes a small, slightly burnt loaf from the corner of the shelf and holds it out to you. "Yours," he says. "Your first day, your first dough, your first mistake, that wasn't a mistake. You made this when the starter first came alive. You smile, turning it in your hands. It's hard and light, the color of desert clay. It's not much to look at. Menka shrugs. Neither are we. But we last. You both laugh, the sound easy, unguarded. A mainstream historical fact. Ancient Egyptian loaves have been found buried with the dead, perfectly preserved by desert air and tomb silence. The grain, the ash, the fingerprint marks, all still there. The world changes, but the bread remains, waiting to be touched again. A quirkier tidbit. One archaeologist swore he could still smell faint sweetness in a 3,000-year-old loaf after brushing away the sand. Whether imagination or truth, you can almost believe it. Some scents simply refuse to die. You sit together on the cool step, watching the moon rise over the rooftops. It glows pale gold, the same color as flour dust. Menka leans back, sighing contentedly. You know, he says, baking's the only kind of magic that feeds everyone, even the magician. You glance at the ovens, still radiating gentle heat. Do you ever wonder, you ask, if the first baker knew what they were doing? If they understood what they'd started? Menka chuckles. No one ever knows they're making history, he says. We just forget a bowl of dough and hope for the best. Historians still argue whether leavening was a stroke of genius or pure accident. But as you sit there, listening to the slow night sounds and the faint ticking of the cooling ovens, you realize it doesn't matter. What began as a mistake became comfort, ritual, life itself. In the quiet, you can almost hear the city breathing, the same rhythm as the dough, the same soft rise and fall. Menka yawns. You'll leave one day, he says sleepily. Maybe you'll teach others. Maybe they'll forget your name but keep your starter. That's how we stay alive. You nod. And you. He smiles. I'll keep baking till I turn to dust. Maybe someone will use me to seal a crack in an oven. I'd like that. You laugh softly, but there's a lump in your throat. He pats your shoulder. Don't look sad. Bakers don't die. We just feed something else. The last ember finally goes dark, a tiny sigh of smoke curling into the night. The bakery settles into stillness. The cats have found their beds in flour sacks. The tools rest neatly against the wall. Somewhere, the faint sound of a flute drifts from the riverbank, a song older than speech. The moon climbs higher, bathing the courtyard in a pale, forgiving glow. You take one last breath of the bread-scented air, warm earth, smoke, yeast, life, and feel the quiet settle deep into you. Menka stretches, stands, and says, Time for sleep, my friend. Tomorrow, we start again. You linger a little longer after he's gone, listening to the silence. You close your eyes. The air feels soft, the stone cool beneath your palms. For a moment, it's as if the whole world is exhaling. And somewhere, in a bowl, under a damp cloth, the dough breathes once more. The ovens are dark now, the fire's gone to rest, but their warmth lingers in the stones, seeping gently into the night air. You can almost feel it wrapping around you, a slow, steady pulse beneath your skin. Thebes hums softly in the distance. The quiet chatter of night watchmen, the low croak of frogs along the Nile, the faint rustle of palm fronds sighing against one another. Breathe in. The scent of the day is still there. Smoke, flour, honey, the ghost of something ancient and kind. Breathe out. Let the heat dissolve from your shoulders, the dust from your thoughts. The world is smaller now, just you and the faint glow of memory, the whisper of bread cooling on clay. Somewhere in the dark, a loaf cracks faintly as it settles, that tiny sound of life exhaling. You imagine it echoing down the centuries, every baker who ever lived pausing for a heartbeat to listen. The same sound, the same breath, shared across time. You picture the river gleaming under the moon, the grain fields sleeping, the quiet ovens dreaming of flame. Everything rises, everything rests, everything begins again. You close your eyes. The air is thick with comfort, the kind that fills every empty space with something warm and human. Menka's voice drifts back like the memory of firelight. Tomorrow we bake again. The last sound you hear is the soft sigh of the night, breathing in time with you. And somewhere deep in that rhythm, the first bread of morning has already begun to rise. Sleep well, traveler. The ovens will wait for you.